Hey friends, this is Marilyn today from tarotclarity.com, and today's video is comparing two decks about 200 years apart, both Italian. And I've been meaning to do this comparison for a long time, and I never have. I think there are some similarities in style, even though one is city and one is country. And like I said, they're like 200 years apart. Let me show you on the map before I tell you what they are, even though you probably saw it in the title. Oh well. Okay, the country deck would have been from Bologna, I think around where my finger is, around 1660. Those of you who know your tarot decks, you know around 1660. What wonderful deck came out of Bologna around 1660? I'll give you a hint. There it is. And then the other one came out of Torin, which I believe is in the Piedmont region, right probably around here where my finger is, of Italy, 200 years later. And that deck, for those of you who know your decks, 1893, City of Torin. What historic tarot deck was that? The Vacchetta. Now, the reason I want to compare these two is because their pips seem similar, but I'm just going to compare the whole deck to each other. And I have several copies of the Mitelli, at least 4. But my favorite is this one, which was done by Benedetti. It was a complete deck. He added the additional 16 cards to complete it for me and others so that we can use it as a reading deck. And then the other is by Meneghello, and I have another. This is another deck I have about 4 of. But the Meneghello version of this is my favorite of the 4 that I have. Okay, now, 1660s Bologna, country, 1893, 230, 40, 50 years later, in Torin, which was more of like a city, the northern area of Italy. So we don't see too much. Things got a little more sophisticated, it seems. The entertainment of this fool character, looks antiquated. Now, some of you, we have had discussions on this in another video, if you want to catch that. And if I can find it, I'll add it below. There's some dialogue about whether this is the fool or this is the fool. But at the moment, I'm inclined to believe that this is the fool and that this is the magician of this particular deck. The Mitelli has unusual images for certain cards, which is probably why I love it so much. But this fool from 230 years later, seems to be more in keeping with what we're accustomed to seeing. We have the fool with some kind of a creature chasing after it. He's got his satchel. Here we see, reference to, like a street hustler. It looks like a pavement, so he might be outdoors. This guy clearly is. Entertaining the masses, entertaining children. Okay, the Mitelli takes liberties with 2 through 5. I think this is the order, the correct order of them, and this is the order that I keep them in. So this is how I have put these cards in order. So we have like a kingish or I think it's two emperors and 2 popes. So I give higher stature to the seated figure, right? So we know these guys are the popes because they have a globe or a orb. I give him precedence because he's got a beard and he's also seated. So I took that clue for the 2 popes to give the seated pope the higher rank. So there's not too many similarities between those 4 cards and these, because these cards had the female pope and the empress, the emperor, And they called it the Hierophant. Isn't that interesting? Hierophant. Wow. Interesting. Both of these cards have a charming Cupid as the lover card, representing the lover. And, in the Mitelli, there are no names on the Triumph cards and no numbers. So their order is different than how I'm presenting it to you. However, I have put these cards in the order that we are accustomed to seeing. And, but by now, it had the standard, by now, 1893 in Italy, the northern part of Italy, we have the standard order. But Cupid is blindfolded. Isn't that interesting? So we might argue that the deck from Torin, the city, 230 years later, is a bit more sophisticated. These images are a bit more antique or rustic. But you never know what you'll see when you compare two decks. You never know. Here we have Justice with her sword and scales in each. In the older Italian decks, we see the Hermit more as an aged individual, an older individual. And he's usually older in the other decks as well. Here he's not wandering, but we see he has there's a pathway. Does he live in that cave, a cave in that mountain? There's his lantern. By now, by 1893, he's got a lantern. You'll notice here there's no hourglass. The only thing that suggests time is that he's infirmed on crutches and he's elderly with his white hair. But he's seen as a virtue, a virtuous condition. He's in a virtuous state, so he has wings. Well, okay, both of these sort of suggest a cornucopia, now this isn't exactly a cornucopia, but this is. But it still has the same sense of money flowing. So it's about money and fortune in that regard. So that's interesting. In true Italian fashion, we see a pillar. But we also see a nod, perhaps, to the Tower of Marseille, which has by now kind of infiltrated into, maybe, at a point where Italy's interest in the Tower waned a little bit. The influence from the French, who were playing it, pretty intently, influenced the Italians, And so the Italians, perhaps, in an order to appeal to maybe a French audience, even though they kept the Italian words and, Italian references, but, a nod to that card, that they put the lion in it. I don't know, I'm just speculating. So, the punishment for a traitor, l'impreso. I'm not sure exactly if that means the hanged one or what that translates to, but for those, I'll probably check afterwards, like you will. But there's speculation that this was an alternate punishment for someone who's done something terrible, like treason. But this is the more characteristic punishment, hanging typically by one foot and being awake. Again, this is more in keeping with what we see coming out of France with, the death card with his scythe and having no regard for whatever stature you had in life. And here's a ship of Moor coming in. to the land of the dead, perhaps. Whereas here, it's again a more rustic, antiquated concept of time. We have the hourglass, which is typical in the hermit's hand, who also represents the passage of time and age. And we have the pyramid, right, which stood for ancient, it was ancient when this card was created. He also has his scythe, however. So I guess the scythe was also an accoutrement of the death card. And did I share Marco Benedetti, Il Meneghello? Both of these devils are among my two favorite devils ever. So when I get to the devil card of Masha's top tarot trumps, these two devils will make an appearance in that video. And here again in the Mitelli, we have an alternate to the Tower card, and I always interpret the Tower card coming after the Devil card. Vanity comes before the fall. And again, vanity comes before the fall. Like he's being struck down for something, And I say it every time I see this card, and in a video I always say, "May God strike me dead if I'm not telling the truth." And there it goes. And as we've seen many times in my videos, the star card of the Mitelli, at some point, I think, became the Hermit of the Marseille, which in turn demanded or required of them to come up with another star image to represent the star. So rather than just having a simple card, a simple image of a star, they decided that the sign of Aquarius would be a really good example to represent the star card, because we wish upon a star and we navigate by the star. And when the Aquarian constellation appears in the night sky, especially in the Middle East or the Eastern world, that's when the rains came. And so when the rains came, that's when we had opportunity, right? So it's very interesting to compare the differences. And 230 years makes a big difference. Okay, we have similar themes for La Luna, the goddess Diana with her hounds and her hunting, and the moon in the background, and here a crab or crustacean. A nod perhaps to what we see in the French decks. Apollo. This is an Italian deck. And despite having influences perhaps from the French, I think the Vacchetta, it's either the Vacchetta or the Vacchetta, excuse me for my pronunciation, I'm not sure which is proper. They're holding on to their concept of the sun and the moon and the stars as being celestial, and whatever gods or goddesses might participate in that. Okay, here we have Judgment. And the older card, we simply have an angel. Like he's making an announcement. Or, "Hear up, everyone. It's time to take your places." Whereas with this image, as with TDM, it suggests having to account for yourself. Okay, time to tell us all about your lives. And the World card. Quite different feelings. And each of these would have a different feel to it in an interpretation, I think. Okay, now here's where I really want to compare these. I really want to compare the pips. Swords. So we start seeing ribbons, and ornate, ornate decorations in 1660 in this deck. And here the Vacchetta really went all out. I mean, we think of the Pamela Coleman Smith deck as being the first illustrated tarot deck, although we know she based many of the images on, or some of her images on the Solabusca, which was, every card was illustrated. So the Italians did have an illustrated deck first, but for the most part, since that was owned by a private family, nobody saw it really. So it must have seemed special if to have pips that were decorative, if not illustrative. But we have items here which would have been, I imagine, easily identifiable by an 1893 audience. Now, bear in mind, too, that the ace, okay, this is unfair because the aces were intact in the Mitelli, but the cards 2 through 5 would not have been. So what Marco did was just create cards in the fashion from 2 to 4, 2 to 5 actually, in the style consistent with the rest of the deck. So I'm just going to show you the Vacchetta until we get to 6, because 2 through 5 of the Mitelli would not have existed. But you see how decorative they are, with just little hints, of meaning. I think they certainly could influence a reading. Like, is that a laurel wreath? Does that suggest an accomplished thing? Okay, here we go. So this is an actual card from the Mitelli deck from 1660. So you see there's like even here, there's a decorative flourish, flourishing. And here, it's much more embellished by the time of the Vacchetta. So I'm off. I made a mistake somewhere. So this was the 6. Oh, 5. Look at this. Okay, this Vacchetta has an error. So this was the 6th, but here they put a 5. So that's an error in the printing, I see. Okay, so here we have 7. So you see, this is like an unusual arrangement of swords. As we have here. So even though this is a much, 230 years earlier in a different part of the country, you see how both of these decks stood out perhaps from what was being done at their respective times for being just a little extra, just a little more special, a little more decorative. I think for sure the Mitelli must have stood out, and I think for sure the Vacchetta must have stood out too, because I know that Vacchetta won awards. So each of these artists embellished, and made it just a little more fancy than what was happening at each of their respective times. Both of these queens are outdoors. I think all of these noble individuals are. I'm not sure if he is or not. He's holding the sword by the blade. Isn't that something? And we see on the cup of the ace the family coat of arms, I guess, of the Benvolio family, which is what Marco used for the backs of the cards, is identifying this deck as having been commissioned by the Benvolio family. Okay, so remember 2 through 5 were creations by Marco in order to complete the deck. So they didn't really exist. And here are the 2 through 5 of the actual deck of the Vacchetta. But I mean, they definitely, this definitely makes you, it's not illustrative, right? It's not illustrative, it's decorative, but it's still, I think it still would persuade you to interpret the image. Now, I have done several videos on both of these decks, so there's no shortage of videos in my channel for either of these. I mean, I've probably done at least a dozen videos on each of these cards, not just by themselves, but comparing them to other cards. Now, the structure, even though there's nothing coming from here, we have the structure of a chopped chalice or top cup, sending water forth like a fountain, although it doesn't continue to here. And sometimes I notice that it's called copa, and sometimes I notice that it's called copa. Cope or cope? Cope? Copa. You see here, go from cope to copa. So those of you who speak Italian, if you could shed some light on that for me. I know in Spanish, word endings change depending on if something is masculine, feminine, or plural or singular. Here's my boyfriend. Now, neither of them have a hat. Neither of them have a wreath in their hair. But he has a cloth. Was that what was supposed to be covering the chalice? I don't know. Here, there's no such thing, but he has one stocking on and one stocking off. And of course, with the backward view of this night, how do you not take this image as part of an interpretation, right? It's the Knight of Cups, but he's a Knight of Cups who's departing a scene, so we have that added dimension. Here, his whatever that is kind of looped in a very loose heart, almost like he's a romantic one. Queen of Cups likes to cook, a culinary queen. This guy reminds me of the visitor of Ebenezer Scrooge, Christmas present day, I guess he was. good time king here. Whereas this king looks a little more worldly. So we have a jester in the baton here. And here we just have the cudgel. Cards 2 through 5, remember, are creations by Marco to complete the deck. Change it from a tarocchino to a tarot deck. Just tells us a little bit about Vacchetta. So both these decks are unusual, even though they're not the same, but they're unusual in that they're highly decorative, right? Much more decorative than what was going on in either of their times. So we see reference to music here with the 6 of batons. Almost like they're, like organ pipes. And so here we have tools. They look like different tools. Here, they're just cudgels, but they're tied up in decorative bows. And now we have a little vignette, like a little story. And this kind of references maybe a harvest. Another reference to music in the 9 of batons. Oh, it is an organ pipe. We have a bird with a long neck. A little Aesop's fable sort of thing, like the stork and the grapes, or whatever bird that is, a heron and the grapes, or whatever. We have a frog, a snail, ladybug, another snail, I like to randomly pull 2 decks from different places, different times, and just see what similarities they may share, or what influences one might have had on the other. Now, it seems like the suit of batons, the courts of batons, seem to have more of a jester reference, and we noticed in the ace, right? Oh, how fortunate. I just picked it up in the right spot. The ace of batons started us out with that feel of a court jester and the bells. So that's very interesting. And also, like if you pulled this, any of the baton suits, with the fool, but the fool here is not a jester, so. It's a very, a very fancy suit. The courts of this suit in the Vacchetta are very fancy and sort of braggartly. Like, notice me, notice me. Now the queen is more calmed down. She's more pastoral. She's got her sheep. And the last suit. For those of you who hung out with me, thank you for being here. You're definitely my kind of people. Here we have the Ace of Coins for both. Both of the original artists took the opportunity to put their names on the Ace of Coin. If I'm not mistaken, Marco took the opportunity to put his name in the Four of Coins, since this card did not exist. And he preserved the identity of the original deck by keeping it intact here, and took the opportunity to show, in 150 years, if people say, hey, this is the guy who created a deck of 78. And the 5, here's 2 in a shield. Is that a shield? And like the Mitelli, the Vacchetta, at least in this card, and maybe some of the others, have faces in the coins, So it really gives us a sense that they're a social suit. Money exchanges hands. Which is probably why money is among the most dirty things you could probably encounter all day. And, it's almost like, aside from being very social with the faces, right, they're tied together. Yet they're all connected here with the ribbon. They're playing a card game. And the courts of the Mitelli of the coins are represented by an individual holding a sack of coins. Rather than showing the coin, it's understood to be inside the sack. Generous queen. Kind of reminiscent of the Lady Fortuna on the Wheel of Fortune, right? Dropping coins. So if we saw this and the wheel card, right, in the same reading, especially if it's about business or whatever, we might get the idea that there's a windfall of material opportunity, right? A good spell, a good financial spell. I don't think I've ever done demonstration readings with the Vacchetta, so I think I won't be able to. I think tomorrow's video will be a demonstration reading with the Vacchetta, because I don't think I've ever done demonstration reading with the Vacchetta, so I think that's what I'll do. I've done many with the Mitelli. So there, friends, I hope you enjoyed the comparison between the country and the city decks, one from Bologna, one from the Piedmont region, Torino, and 230 years between them. Until next time, friends, peace and stay well.